Hi everyone, my name is Carla Wagener. You can see my photo over there, and today I'm going to discuss how the introduction of guttural toads have impacted the endemic western leopard toad's gut microbiome. This work forms part of my master's that I completed at the Center of Excellence for Invasion Biology. Well, I say it forms part of my master's, but it was mostly a side project. I just want to also acknowledge my collaborator, John Measy, who you know already. He spoke earlier. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So a lot of the times when a new species is introduced into an environment, we're concerned with the impacts they'll have on native biodiversity. So usually we look at direct and indirect impacts. This would concern things such as competition with native species or predation, but also what they're bringing along with them and what they could potentially transfer to native species, such as parasites, which John mentioned Natasha studied for her master's. But in recent years, we've actually found out that hosts or species, and these include invasive species, actually come with billions of microorganisms living inside or on them. These microorganisms are collectively known as the microbiome, and as you can see, they've interested many scientists, including myself. What I'm particularly interested in, and many other researchers as well, is actually the gut microbiome, because 90% of these billions of microorganisms is found in our gut. But why would we want to study the gut microbiome? So the gut microbiome is super cool. It's extremely variable and plastic and responds really quickly to changes in environmental factors. These include things such as dietary changes, climate changes, as well as changes in species interactions. You can see where I'm going a bit with this, changes in species interactions, which usually happens when you introduce a new species into a new environment. But also the gut microbiome is especially important for host phenotypes. So these include things such as digestion efficiency, performance. So they actually found that your performance in a marathon, so how fast you can complete a marathon, depends on your gut microbiota composition, and as well as behavior, which I think is also really interesting. But currently, most of these studies is based on lab environments and on human laboratory and domestic animal microbiomes. And since 2016, a lot of reviews have noticed this and said, well, we don't know anything about the gut microbiome in a conservation perspective, and a lot of these reviews also mention that we should be looking at how invasive species alter the gut microbes of native species. Well, this is actually the knowledge gap we wanted to fill. We wanted to know how does the introduction of the guttural toad impact the endemic western leopard toad's gut microbiome, as well as is there any spillover or spillback from invasive and native toads? So to answer this question, we collected fecal material from 4 different groups. So firstly, we collected fecal material from guttural toads in the Durban area. This is because we know that guttural toads were introduced from Durban into Cape Town. So in Cape Town, we also collected guttural toads in the introduced range, which is the yellow spots over here. They're shaded in yellow. Those are our guttural toads. But then we also collected western leopard toad fecal material that were in the presence of the introduced guttural toads. Those are indicated by the blue, as well as western leopard toads indicated by the green, where guttural toads have not spread or been introduced yet. So once we had the toads, we placed them into a sterile container. They took a nice dump and we shipped this nice poop off to SAF, and they did all the next gen sequencing for us, and I got back the really awesome big data set. Okay, so I'm just going to jump straight into the results. I won't bore you with any of the statistical details. So this is a PCOA. It displays the dispersion, so how similar or dissimilar the individual gut microbiomes are from one another. So if they're clustered together, like we see the Durban guttural toads are over here in pink, then they are very similar to one another. And then we also have in our Cape Town area indicated here, we have our western leopard toads in blue. They're clustering also very closely together with one another. They're not in the presence of any guttural toads. But our western leopard toads that are in areas where guttural toads have been introduced, which is indicated by the triangles, you can see they have significantly shifted their gut microbiota once guttural toads have been introduced. And what's interesting is guttural toads in the same area, which is indicated by the pink and the triangles over here, they share more bacteria with the western leopard toads than they do with their, say, the guttural toads in Durban or western leopard toads with other western leopard toads in Cape Town, but they still are significantly different. So what this means is that potentially western leopard toads are still able to maintain a distinct gut microbiome, even though guttural toads were introduced. But we don't know if this is really a positive thing because, as you can see, they've completely changed their gut microbiome profile from one another. And here I just have the toads to remind you which group is which kind of group. So I want to jump into the spill over and spill back. So what we found is once these two species interacted, guttural toads transferred these three important genuses to the western leopard toads. You can see they got it over here. And they're also present in guttural toads coming from their native region, but they're not present in western leopard toads. They're obviously not in regions where guttural toads have been introduced. So this is really interesting. Potentially the guttural toads have introduced new bacteria to the western leopard toads, but it is also really likely that this might indicate a shift in diet because all these genuses are related to the digestion efficiency of the toads. And we also saw a completely new species that wasn't in any of the other groups. They were only in this western leopard toads where guttural toads were present. And they're also related to digestion efficiency. So it's very likely western leopard toads actually are experiencing a dietary shift due to the guttural toads. So previously we only focused on spillover and spillback, but what can also happen is bacteria that are already present, they can suddenly become really increased or decreased in the area where the guttural toads were introduced. To illustrate this, I have a log-2-fold change plot. On the x-axis is the log-2-fold change, which is just the severity of the change in abundance of bacterial genuses, which will appear on the y-axis over here. So if one of these points that will appear in a moment falls on the left-hand side of the dotted line over here, it means that there's an increase in abundance or higher abundance in the bacterial genuses in areas where guttural toads have not been introduced. If it falls on the right-hand side, it means there's an increase in abundance in western leopard toads of bacterial genuses where guttural toads have been introduced. So what we first see is there's a sudden increase in this species, which is called Bacteroidetes. It is very similarly pronounced to the previous species that I mentioned in the previous plot, but it's not the same genus. So this species has a quite diversity of pathogens, which usually stimulates a really strong immune response from the host species. However, we see a decrease in different genuses that actually supplies immune resistance against pathogenic bacteria in the gut. So it's really interesting to see that there's suddenly this increase in pathogenic bacteria in the western leopard toad's gut microbiome, but there's also a decrease in their immune response to these pathogenic bacteria. Lastly, we also see increase in firmicutes, which are important for the fermentation in the gut, which could also potentially support the hypothesis that their diet is potentially shifting. Okay, I just want to finish off by summarizing our results because I kind of bombarded you all with loads of cool results. So we did find that the introduction of the invasive guttural toads does significantly alter the gut microbiome of the endemic western leopard toad, and this is especially concerning because it indicates that there is impacts on the native species digestion efficiency as well as their health. So this really shows us that in our efforts to mitigate the impacts of the guttural toad as well as their spread into other western leopard toad areas, we shouldn't stop with this because they could potentially have severe impacts on native and western leopard toads. But I also want to mention that our study is very superficial. Hopefully, we would want to investigate the direct impacts of these gut microbiome shifts on western leopard toads phenotypes, but this might be a bit difficult because they're threatened, so we are not able to conduct any experimental studies on them. Lastly, I just want to conclude that when we consider the impact of invasive species, we should not just be looking at the host itself, but obviously think of it as a organism that's bringing loads of organisms with it, and this can have potential implications for a lot of areas in conservation science. I just want to end off with thanking the toad team or the toad people. I wouldn't have been able to do this without the amazing support of many organizations as well as people. Thanks.